Well, I have spent my week doing two things. One, working in the garden. I'm sure that a lot of you also found yourselves outside digging in the dirt this week. So nice to have some sunshine. But the other thing that's actually been taking up more time is I have been playing a lot of harp. And that is because this coming week, I'm going to go into the studio to record my new album. I am so excited for this and also a little nervous. But playing harp as much as I've been playing, especially the past month, has given me a lot of opportunity to think about my own musical training and remember what it was like, for instance, at the beginning, because a good thing about playing harp for 35 years or so is that, you're better than you were when you started. And I think about way back what it was like as a new harpist, but I also have been thinking about what it was like as a harp teacher. And thinking about how when people start to play any instrument, or even when people sometimes learn how just to sing, we often think the first step of learning how to make music is to make a sound, to pluck a string, or to move a bow across a string, or to blow into a saxophone, to make a sound. And for a lot of us, that is the first thing we do. But really, the very first part of learning any kind of music is learning how to listen, which includes being silent, because of course you can't listen if you're talking. And then you get into the next phase where you start to be able to listen actually to the things that you yourself are playing. That can take a while. I remember once when my child was learning violin, and man, beginning violin, it takes fortitude. Thankfully, my child's father was a band director and was used to this. And there was one practice session, Blue was probably 4 years old, where, his tone was terrible. I don't know any other way to say it. Like, it sounded like screeching, right? And his dad was trying to get him to play in a way that was a little less screechy, and Blue was being very resistant to the interventions. And so finally, his dad said, "Blue, if you don't try to make this sound better, I'm going to record it and make you listen to it." That did the trick. You have to learn how to listen. I remember as a music student in college, getting my first listening assignment where you actually had to go to the library and go into a listening room. It's before the internet was really a thing. And, you had to put on these headphones and, spend a lot of time in there just listening. And the first listening assignment I got was to some, I think, Beethoven string quartet or something, and it just felt like a wall of sound. And my job was to really delineate all the different parts and the counterpoint and stuff and all the different things going on. But at the beginning, it just sounded like this wall of sound. It was too big. It was too much. I couldn't really hear anything that I was supposed to be hearing. But over time, with a lot of listening, with a lot of not talking, you start to be able to pull things apart. And this is complicated because there's no step-by-step really on how to do this. It really is just being there, being present, and opening your ears, and trusting that whatever subconscious things are going on will happen. Now, I'm saying all that because I think to understand our gospel reading for today, it requires the same type of listening. The gospel reading from the Gospel of John is a little hard to read. It sounds pretty exclusionary, pretty blamey. Maybe isn't your first choice for a scripture to be read. Maybe you like Psalm 23 a lot better. I can certainly understand that. But I think when we listen to this gospel reading with that kind of openness and careful listening, we start to see some really interesting things taking shape. So the first line of this counterpoint that I want to bring to your attention is that, I'm not sure it's easy today, but in first century Palestine, it was definitely not easy to be a sheep. You were the choice animal for temple sacrifices if you were a sheep. Every morning, according to Jewish law, 2 lambs would be sacrificed, or it was 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening, something like that. These sacrifices were commanded in the ancient Levitical law, in Judaism, and it was taken very seriously. So sheep were not the only animal to be sacrificed. If you didn't have enough money for a sheep, you could buy a turtle dove or a pigeon. Sometimes there was a cow or, whatever. But sheep were like the animal to be sacrificed. Not only that, so not only do you have human predators, but you also have, the natural, like wolves and stuff, right? You have all the animals out there in the land that also think sheep are pretty tasty. You live your life in danger. It was also not easy to be a shepherd, by the way. We often think of maybe paintings from churches of our childhood or things in the children's Bible that make it look like being a shepherd was just so peaceful. It's a lot like gardening. If you ever see a picture of someone gardening, you just think, oh, it's just picking flowers. But no, when you're gardening, you're in the ground and you're like, I'm feeling it in my shoulders this week. So I think it's a lot like shepherding. It looks maybe peaceful. We like to think it's pastoral, but it was actually a lot of rocky ground. It was a lot of walking. It was all outdoors. You're sleeping outdoors most of the time. And it's dangerous. You had to protect the sheep from the predators. Oftentimes, that meant herding the sheep into a cave and protecting them with your very body. So when Jesus says in this reading that he's the gate, that is probably actually what he's referring to, is how shepherds would actually use their body to keep the sheep in and predators out. So, second strand of counterpoint, the community of John. So, as many of you know, there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Every Gospel was written to a different community in a different time. John was the latest gospel, or you can think of as most recent, probably put together around 80, 90, 100. And it was written to a community that was struggling with its place among Judaism. The community of John was likely a group of people who had been expelled from the synagogues at the time. And it probably felt to them very much like being a vulnerable, scared sheep out in the pasture. Being expelled from the synagogue wasn't just, now I have to go to a different church. It meant relationships that you depended on, that you trusted, that you had known your whole life, altered, changed, maybe even broken beyond repair. So these were people who felt very vulnerable. Some of you I know what that's like. When someone tries to live differently in a family, for example, even if it's a healthy change, there's a whole theory about this called family systems theory. That even when someone tries to make a healthy change in a family that is not a healthy system, the healthy person can be expelled from the family, can be cut off, or looked at as the problem, even if they are the one actually trying to live in a healthy manner. So that's the second strand. Third strand of counterpoint, and this is maybe even the most important. The community of John had its context for this gospel, but we too have our own context. And that colors how we hear this ancient story. I'm thinking particularly of the strand of Christianity that is so vocal in our country these days, that is more about exclusion and doctrinal purity, and maybe most of all, about power and dominion and the idea of making this somehow a Christian country, even though this country was founded on, among other things, the freedom of religion. And I was thinking a lot about the thieves and bandits in this story that Jesus talks about. Last night, just kind of randomly, I watched a documentary called True Believers. And it was filmed in 2024. It was a young woman who had grown up in a fundamentalist strand of Christianity. And the documentary was all about her learning process, about how what we typically call the religious right was mobilized in the 70s and 80s, specifically using abortion rights as a wedge issue in order to get people to vote. I learned many things in this documentary. One of them that I learned was actually Billy Graham was pro-choice. Didn't know that. So yeah, it was an intentional gathering of people who had been excluded economically, culturally from the mainstream, bringing them together to make them into a force of power, not just to have a voice, but to dominate the culture. And so I think having that as part of our national culture right now can make us hear this passage as though it's about excluding others or about dominating others, instead of being about a safe haven for people who are themselves vulnerable and excluded. Now, the next line of counterpoint I want to talk about is really just a bunch of questions that this all brings up. If we bring together the realities of sheep and shepherds, the reality of the community of John, the reality of our current moment, there are a couple questions that come to my mind. Maybe you have some as well in yours. The first one is, when does our desire for safety and togetherness become exclusion? I think that's an important question. Another question, when does self-protection become aggression? And if we think about people who were manipulated in this country into becoming a political force that they are now, and remember that they were vulnerable to this because they themselves were being economically and politically excluded. Another question is, how can we protect ourselves from the siren song of those thieves and bandits who come to us when we feel vulnerable in any way, promising us that we too can become wolves if we only follow them? Sometimes that voice, of course, doesn't come from outside of us. Sometimes it comes from inside. It's the voice of getting even. It's the voice of being right at all costs. But we are also barraged by these voices every day outside of us, telling us to protect what we have, no matter what the outcome, to buy things that keep the feelings of vulnerability away, to numb ourselves to other people's pain and our own pain, because it's a dog-eat-dog world. The final line of counterpoint is about this statement that Jesus says. He says, they know his voice. The sheep know his voice. Now, I imagine this to be the way, for those of you who are parents, you know, even if you're on the playground with a bunch of other kids there, when your kid calls out mommy or daddy, you can tell. You know your child's voice, even across a playground. But maybe that's actually more how God knows our voice. I think often hearing the voice of Jesus is more akin to how I felt as a music student faced with that wall of sound. The voice of God, the voice of Jesus. If only it were so easy to discern. Sitting with that wall of sound, I think it took faith. A commitment to keep listening, even when the lines of melody seemed jumbled and indistinct. We often think of faith as being the same as belief, and belief is often the basis for exclusion of others in the history of the church. But I'd like to suggest, as I've said before, that faith is more like a commitment to keep listening, even when the lines of melody are not clear. To keep listening even when it feels dark and you don't know where that shepherd is. To keep listening even when the world is really noisy. And even when you think you might actually just be all alone anyway. You are not alone. You are not alone. You are part of a flock that is open to all who continue to listen for that shepherd's voice, a flock that transcends time and culture and even death itself. Thanks be to God.